Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 1 Midfielders Cheat Sheet. As far as the landscape of FPL right now, we are of course a little bit far away from the actual start of Game Week 1, and that also means that a lot of changes will be expected. We know that there's going to be a lot of turnover in terms of players and also within managers, and that's going to mean a lot of changes that we need to stay on top of in the preseason. So Man City is a good example of that. We always know there are going to be some iterations of changes. We also know that there might be some outgoing players, which I'll discuss when I talk about the cheat sheet at length. And then, of course, Chelsea, I think, is a perfect example of that, where you have incoming players, outgoing players, and a new manager in Pochettino that could definitely change the tactical style of Chelsea and also find ways to incorporate some of the options that we have in this list. As far as the budget options in this list, if we just move on quickly, Garnacho is an option that I've actually put as an avoid. And the reason why that is because for me, Garnacho is definitely one of the young starlets in this league. And his pricing is, in my opinion, a little bit absurd. I do think that, of course, he's going to struggle to actually find consistent starts at this point in time. But already at the end of last season, we got to saw much more minutes from Garnacho, and I think he was an extremely vibrant player for United. And of course, there is a small sample size with him, but if we ever get the hint that Garnacho will actually play consistent minutes and maybe even start ahead of someone like a Jadon Sancho at the start of the season, particularly because of Antony's late injury, we could say that Garnacho could be a steal potentially, but I think right now it's too early to say that, so therefore he's an avoid, but definitely someone that I'm going to look out for. As far as Enciso, I think he's an absolute steal considering there are some outgoings and maybe March will struggle to actually still find fitness by game week 1. That's going to be one decision point because Enciso, when March was actually out of the team, was able to play between either the 10 spot, which was sometimes occupied by Gross, sometimes occupied by McAllister, or even Buonanotte, but he also occupied the right wing position at times. And I do think with now some of the outgoings for Brighton, and despite João Pedro coming in, you could still see a lot of minutes played for Enciso, and I do think he's an early good budget option to think about. Potentially the minutes might be on the low side because De Zerbi is someone who is prone to rotating, and Enciso unfortunately wasn't one of the players like a March, like a Mitoma, who actually got consistent minutes. So he's still one that I would cautiously look at, but the underlying stats are simply fantastic, and of course we know Brighton are effectively a top 5 offense. As far as Benrahma, he's an option because he simply is the penalty taker for this West Ham team, and I really just don't think that West Ham could be as bad as they were from the offensive point of view like they were in the previous one. They are losing, of course, Declan Rice, so that just means the defensive solidity of the team and overall, let's say the shape of the midfield will change, but I am expecting that West Ham can actually kick on a little bit, and we'll have to see, of course, how they manage Europe. But Benrahma is one of those early players to think about because he is a set-piece player for West Ham, but at this point in time, only a differential. As far as Mitoma and Mbeumo, I think they're the absolute steals, and probably the first iteration of midfielders that I would seriously consider in my draft, because at this point in time, I think a lot of people are thinking about a 3-5-2 or a 3-4-3 formation, and there's no reason really to go into the 4.5 midfielders or even the 5.5 midfielders. I think at 6.5, we're really looking at some of the value midfielders and potentially some that actually rival some of the more expensive midfielders in Mitoma and Mbeumo. I wouldn't even mind someone going for both. And the reason why that is because Mitoma is someone that we know is absolutely nailed in this team. He only really struggled for minutes when Brighton had a lot of double game weeks, and we're not going to see that at the start of the season, even though Brighton are involved in Europe. I just think that Mitoma is someone who, even when De Zerbi mentioned that he was struggling to play with these double game weeks, ended up actually playing a lot more minutes than we expected on those last 4 to 5 game weeks for the season. So I am expecting him to play a lot of minutes, and the same for someone like Mbeumo right after. Mitoma, anyways, when you actually look at the underlying stats, very comparable to someone like March. Keep in mind, of course, that March did play early parts of the season at the right wing back position when he was under Potter as a manager. So you could actually argue that Mitoma and March are very comparable assets. I wouldn't really have a huge fuss if you actually wanted to opt to go for March over Mitoma. But ultimately, with March maybe coming back from an injury, it's going to be a little bit of a slow start for him compared to someone like Mitoma, who unfortunately wasn't actually great when it came to converting chances at the end of the season, but simply found himself in elite positions. As far as Mbeumo, he's going to be the penalty taker for this Brentford team, as far as we currently understand, and I do think that makes him even more of a better asset than last year. When you actually look at the underlying stats, I mean, he is actually already comparable to some of these top options, like a Mitoma, like a March, and even better than, of course, someone like Gross, who is also a penalty taker now for this Brighton team, at least based on our expectations. So for me, because Mbeumo is now going to benefit from clean sheets, because he already has better conversion ratios compared to someone like a Mitoma and March, he is actually, for me, the better pick over Matoma at this point in time, and that's kind of my early assumption on him. As far as Eze, I do love Eze as a pick, and I do think Crystal Palace actually have a decent run of favorable fixtures to start the season, and he is a penalty taker as well, but you can clearly see that there is a little bit of lacking in terms of the expected assists, and I do think Crystal Palace overall are a much worse offense than a Brighton, than a Brentford. And that's going to be why I'm probably going to shy away from Eze to start with, but I still think he's a great option and therefore a second tier player at this point in time. As we move on now towards the 7.0 players, I do think Sterling is one of the absolute hidden gems of the season. I mean, he's not really a hidden gem in the sense that we all know what Sterling is capable of. He's had multiple 200 plus point seasons in the past. We've also seen a fantastic Euro run from him. And of course, the recent years of Sterling have been much more soured, but he still is actually in his athletic prime, so to speak. And despite struggling with some injuries last season, still played around 1,800 minutes. I think the biggest and most damning thing was actually he was one of the better players under Tuchel, but performed much worse and actually had less minutes under Potter. And of course, we know Frank Lampard is seriously incapable of coaching a serious Premier League offense, and therefore everyone who actually played for Frank Lampard's Chelsea had terrible offensive stats. And that's why I think Sterling actually has some pretty poor stats on the face of it. But when you actually look and let's say compare it to someone like Mount, who was also suffering, right, with all this sort of changes in the coming and goings of Chelsea last season, you can see that Sterling still actually had very respectable numbers. And considering he is at a 7.0 price, I do think Sterling is a very serious option to start the season with, provided that we actually know that he's going to get consistent minutes based on the preseason and what Pochettino's cooking up so far. As far as Mount, he's someone that I'm not seriously considering at this point in time. I think the biggest thing with Mount overall is the fact that you have to kind of consider what role he's going to play. I mean, he's going to be maybe in a dual 8 structure with Bruno, but at times he could be playing slightly deeper. We'll have to sort of see what Ten Hag plans to do around that, because of course Bruno has at multiple times in the season played deep as well, but we know that someone like Eriksen was also playing almost effectively some holding deep lying creative roles for this team. So it really does depend on how Erik Ten Hag plans to use him. We do expect, of course, Mount to play higher up, but he's not the penalty taker for United. Neither does he have nearly as great numbers when it comes to expected goals per 90 for Rashford. So therefore, I don't really think Mount is as serious as an option at this point in time, even though his price is incredibly appealing considering he's a much cheaper player compared to a Bruno, compared to a Rashford. If we move on now towards the 7.5 options, this is another tier where I think, we're getting fantastic steals this season. And Maddison, of course, has gotten an upgrade in terms of the actual team he's playing for. If Maddison is actually going to get consistent minutes, I think he's going to be an absolute steal. Maddison historically has been one of the most creative players in the league, and you can see that in the expected assists per 90 numbers. But his also conversion ratio is fantastic. One of the big things, however, is you'll have to see how Maddison will take set pieces and how that compares and contrasts to someone like Heung-min Son. Son is currently one of the players who's actually on set pieces for the Spurs team, and that's going to take a lot away from Maddison. So what we have to see in the early preseason is to see how Maddison and Son play together, who's on set pieces, and whether that actually takes away from Maddison as an asset or Son as an asset. Son inevitably, for me, I think is going to have a better goal scoring season. He has some more creative players around him. Hopefully Bentancur coming back into the team will help as well. But in my opinion, you're probably looking at either one of Maddison or Son to be the more interesting option to choose from. I don't really think Kulusevski or Richarlison are serious options at this point in time. And Maddison and Son, historically, for the last 4 to 5 years in football, have actually been one of the most highest overperforming players when it comes to the quality of finishing in years past. So despite Son's dip last year, I have full confidence in him being able to sort of rectify that with a good season again. We also knew, of course, that he was dealing with a sports hernia, so we'll have to see what happens there. But ultimately, Maddison is in his prime as well, in a better team, and hopefully can actually do as well as he did really for this Leicester team last season. And that would actually already make him a fantastic option. With Foden and Mahrez, one of the tricky things here, of course, is going to be minutes. I'm actually expecting that maybe Mahrez or Bernardo Silva is going to go to the Saudi League, which actually strengthens Foden's minutes. At this point in time, Foden has an asterisk because I personally think he's a green option, but I know and understand a lot of people have some reservations, right? When you look at a team like Arsenal or you look at a team like United, you have players like Bruno, players like Saka, players like Odegaard, or even Rashford, who are playing consistent 90 minutes per game effectively, right? Rashford, when he's not injured, is actually that sort of player. And so, of course, it doesn't seem to make sense to go for Foden, who's a little bit of a punt. But I still think that because of the KDB injury, because of Gundogan leaving, you have some midfield spots opened up for Foden to play there flexibly, and he can also rotate with some of the right wingers, which he has in the past. So that's why I think Foden's minutes are actually going to be higher than usual, and why I think he's definitely one option to think about starting the season with, provided that we actually see him within the team in preseason. As far as Martinelli, I do think he's an absolute steal. Yes, he's going to struggle for, reaching the same levels of minutes compared to a Saka, compared to an Odegaard, but for that reason, FPL has given him a bit of a price decrease at 8.0, and I do think he's more than justified there. He's a very good overperformer when it comes to finishing, and I do think Martinelli will have room to grow this season. Now, Trossard, of course, is going to pose a huge question when it comes to his minutes, but I think Martinelli is more than capable of staving him off, at least early in the season, like we saw in the previous year. Now, of course, Trossard came in halfway into the season for Arsenal, but ultimately Martinelli was performing so well that he also made it very hard for Trossard to get consistent minutes. So Martinelli is definitely one of the options to think about. Havertz alongside Martinelli is an interesting one because with now Granit Xhaka confirmed to leave with Bayer Leverkusen based on Fabrizio Romano's tweets, I am now thinking that Havertz is actually quite a serious option for FPL. One thing that concerns me about Havertz is really how much he's struggled in the Premier League in years past. Now, you could argue that he's been mismanaged by multiple different managers, but that's, of course, a big claim because that already includes Tuchel, a Champions League winning manager as well. And ultimately, I don't think we can easily say that every Arsenal transfer in the future is going to work. At one point in the time, we saw that Mudryk was very close to Arsenal, and the way that we rate Mudryk now is completely different. Of course, maybe you could argue that Arsenal would also utilize Mudryk really well, but there are going to be some transfers that don't necessarily work. And I do think that the role of Granit Xhaka was very interesting because he did also have to sort of actually receive the ball quite deep into the field and actually play quite a defensive role considering Zinchenko's role in the team. And then he also found himself with great attacking goal-scoring positions in the pitch himself. And that's what Havertz is going to benefit from. He's going to benefit from what I said in terms of the kind of touches that Granit Xhaka actually got inside the box, which was actually absurdly high. And maybe he will benefit from there. But he has also historically been, at least in the Premier League, an underperformer when it comes to finishing, very much like Gabriel Jesus. So that is a point of concern and why I'm not so interested in Havertz to start the season with. However, the minutes look actually very positive compared to what we would expect because of Granit Xhaka leaving and therefore the Arsenal midfield spots opening up one for Havertz effectively. Now, as far as the 8.5 options, I think Saka, Odegaard, Bruno are exquisite options. I think you can actually go with all three options, and I think that would be a very template midfield team. Ultimately, you're probably going to be looking to go for maybe triple United, maybe even triple Arsenal, and you could easily get towards that by still going for Saka, Odegaard, and Fernandes, whilst foregoing Salah in the team. And that's sort of what the early template seems to be showing to us, particularly if you're going to go for Haaland, who's going to be arguably a perma captain for the early fixtures. Trent, of course, can be an easy Game Week 2 captain to kind of cover Salah in that fantastic Liverpool game. But this is sort of the landscape of FPL right now. I do think that this Arsenal team were fantastic when it comes to the attacking. And maybe if you don't actually back their defense, there's no reason to say that their attack wasn't exquisite. Even when they had a pretty poor run of form closing out the end of the season, we still saw them absolutely batter Wolves on Game Week 38 and still score quite a consistent amount of goals despite actually slipping and actually conceding more than they usually did. I think the defense, of course, was the one that faltered the most when it came to this Arsenal team and how they actually struggled to compete with City at the end of the season. So that really doesn't hamper the midfielders. You might lose a bit of clean sheet points, but I don't think that they're going to be any worse because Saliba's coming back to the team. He's also topped up on his contract. So Arsenal players, they're perfect. And Son, for me, is the odd one out here in this sort of price point where if you're, let's say, skipping on Salah, I don't think there's a need to really stretch your budget to go towards Son. We've already shown that Maddison is someone who could actually steal the set pieces from him. You need to sort of stay tuned towards that. And also, he's just a little bit more expensive compared to someone like a Rashford, who I would argue is playing for a much better team and could also play the forward position right now. So one of the things with Son and Rashford is that they're very similar in that they are sort of these left-wing sort of forward hybrids where they're both not on penalties, but usually have fantastic numbers. Son, usually he makes up for it with elite finishing and conversion, which he didn't have in the previous year. So that's going to be one dampener. Whereas with Rashford coming off of a career year, I just think he's an option that we need to seriously think about. And I'm definitely not opposed to, just like we talked about how you can double up on Saka and Martinelli or Saka and Odegaard, you can definitely double up on Fernandes and Rashford too. I really think that would still be sensible, particularly if, let's say, you were to forego Trent Alexander-Arnold in your draft structure. And then Salah, of course, I still think is a supreme option. You can see that being the case because his expected goal numbers are actually still incredibly elite compared to his peers in the midfield. And that's sort of the landscape of FPL right now. I think you could generally go for a Tumium structure, but why go for it when you have so many options that are all green options that are all fantastic at a much cheaper price than Salah? And because you're not going to be captaining Salah very, very often to start the season, I just don't see the value there. But independently as an asset, I can understand why he would still be great. I just think that based on the template structure and you having to be forced to make a 3-5-2 or 3-4-3 formation. I mean, you could go for a 4-5-1 as well. There isn't really necessarily a need to go for Salah at this point in time. And to actually round out this sort of video, I did want to quickly go through some players to avoid. And the players to avoid for me are as follows. Bernardo is a very obvious one. Grealish and De Bruyne as well. I mean, when we look at this Man City team, one of the key things to think about is that De Bruyne is coming back with an injury. I don't think he's going to start the season. Bernardo is someone who usually doesn't have fantastic numbers. You can see on the underlying stats that they're very, very poor. And of course, this is simply because he plays multiple different roles for the City team. And that's actually going to be an issue, right? Because sometimes, even though he has very consistent minutes, one of the issues that Bernardo struggles with is that he will sometimes have to play deep for the team. He'll have to play different roles, and therefore it's not really beneficial towards FPL. As far as Grealish, we know that he is someone who's incredibly useful when it comes to actually City's ability to control the game, to also slow the tempo of the game. But that, of course, once again, has no bearing to FPL whatsoever. He has some of the worst underlying stats compared to his peers in terms of Foden and Mahrez, and also when it comes to actually goal conversion, right, and clinical performance and finishing, then of course Foden and Mahrez are a level above Grealish, even though he actually has very, very good minutes. And when you look at other options outside of City, I mean, Almiron and Mudryk feature on this list. I think with Mudryk, I actually expect him to have a much better year this year, but we also have to clearly see what Pochettino is going to do with his Chelsea team, what formation he's going to start out with, and whether Mudryk's going to get minutes. He has played incredibly well in the Euro U21 tournament, but that doesn't really, of course, have any bearing to FPL whatsoever or the Premier League. So we'll have to see and probably wait and see with Mudryk over the course of this season. And with Almiron, I think one of the issues, of course, is that later on in the year, we saw that he was actually dealing with a lot of rotation. And despite his numbers being very good at one kind of purple patch early on in the previous year, he did sort of run into a little bit of a red streak near the end where he was struggling to actually convert a lot of chances. And in fact, Wilson was the one who actually stepped up late in that season to convert an exquisite amount of chances. But Wilson also had fantastic XG, and that's why you have to compare it to someone like Almiron, even though he's really well priced. I think because Newcastle have such a bad run to start the season, he's not really an option to think about. Meanwhile, when you look at someone like Bowen, I think I talked about how Benrahma is an interesting option because he's much cheaper, but Bowen is just still a little bit too overpriced for me, even though he clearly is the talisman of this West Ham team. But because he's not on penalties, I just don't think is a serious option. As far as Anthony, I'm fairly certain he's still going to deal with the injury situation that he sort of found himself in. And Sancho, of course, I think he's had a bit of a struggle with the Premier League, and he still is a little bit oddly priced. I think Mount is actually probably someone that I'd probably rate a little bit over Sancho at this point in time, so that's going to be one thing to think about. But when we talk about Anthony and Sancho, I mean, Anthony has really good expected goals per 90 stats, but his minutes weren't particularly high because this United team actually did rotate quite often, and Anthony was one of those players, very much like Anthony Martial, who was actually getting rotated off at around 65 to 70 minutes. So the minutes are already incredibly low compared to, let's say, a Rashford or Fernandes. And I think Mount's going to take some minutes from them, Garnacho as well. As far as Szoboszlai, he's going to be an interesting option for Liverpool, but I think he's going to be playing centre mid. And at 7.0, I don't really see the value towards him. Trossard, of course, a very similar issue where he's going to be sort of on that bench as the 12th man of this Arsenal team, even though he was exquisite. And you can actually see his goal plus assist over 90 conversion being incredibly high. Just right now, I just wouldn't say that he's a very serious option to think about. Richarlison's an interesting one because I think he's coming off the bench more often. We'll have to see, of course, with Angie what's going to happen. But at this point in time, I don't think I could really seriously consider Richarlison or Kulusevski as picks. And of course, that's going to round out these players to avoid. And of course, the midfielders cheat sheet at this point in time. So let's stay tuned to the preseason and see how it develops. And I hope that I can narrow down the cheat sheet so that it's much more easily accessible for you guys as we head towards the start of FPL Game Week 1. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.